To stop the Ottoman Empire's expansion into the Balkans, the Christian nations of Europe banded together in 1396 for a massive crusade. This alliance of European warriors and knights, led by King Sigismund of Hungary, set out to secure the eastern front of Christendom and retake lost territory. However, pride, division, and arrogance resulted in a catastrophic conflict at Nicopolis, where Sultan Bayezid I's well-organized army delivered a decisive loss. This crucial conflict was a watershed, demonstrating both the Ottoman Empire's might and the weaknesses of a split Europe. When the entire Crusader army had assembled, King Sigismund of Hungary was ecstatic to see the vast army around him in Budapest. There were about 20,000 troops in the army, which included knights and warriors from throughout Europe. Charles the Fearless headed the French army. Numerous prominent Burgundian knights and nobles were also part of the French component. King Sigismund of Hungary, who was also the general commander of the Crusader armies, commanded the Hungarian army. Philip II, Duke of Burgundy, headed the Burgundian army and was instrumental in planning and assisting with the crusade. Additionally, there were German troops under the command of different German princes and nobles. Knights and soldiers from the Holy Roman Empire were also part of the German force. Under the direction of the Grand Master of the Order, the Knights Hospitaller also appeared. Smaller contingents of knights and soldiers from Wallachia, Poland, and Italy were under the leadership of local nobles and leaders. King Sigismund was pleased that so many people had shown up and was sure that he would win. An estimated 20,000 troops made up the Ottoman force as well. Prince Stefan Lazarovich, the brother-in-law of Sultan Bayezid, commanded 1,500 Serbian heavy cavalry knights in the Ottoman army. The crusade departed Dijon on April 30th, 1396, to drive the Turks out of the Balkans and subsequently advance to Constantinople's help. The Crusaders marched along the Danube River. After liberating Palestine and the Holy Sepulchre by marching through Syria and Turkey, they would triumphantly return to Europe by sea. Vidin, the capital of western Bulgaria before it was taken over by the Turks, was their first objective. Ivan Shratsimir of Bulgaria, the king of Vidin, quickly gave up since he was not inclined to defend his Turkish conquerors against a vast crusader force. The execution of Turkish officers in the defending garrison was the sole violent event. The Crusaders got overconfident after the French were persuaded by this event that the Turks couldn't compete with them in the field. Oryahovo, a formidable stronghold 75 kilometers from Vidin, was the next target. The French conducted a nighttime forced march to arrive at the castle ahead of their friends, frustrated by the lack of opportunity to demonstrate their valor and military prowess. They got there early in the morning, right before the Turkish troops emerged to demolish the bridge over the moat. The French launched an assault. The French took the bridge in heavy fighting, but they couldn't advance until Sigismund and the main force showed up there. When the other Crusaders showed up later that day, the troops merged and made it to Oryahovo's fortifications. On the promise that their lives and property would be protected, the residents of Oryahovo consented to surrender to Sigismund the following morning. After the gates were opened, the French violated Sigismund's promise by robbing and slaughtering the inhabitants. Along the road, the Crusaders attacked one or two settlements as they advanced on Nicopolis. Importantly, they avoided a castle from which messengers managed to get word of the Christian force to Bayezid. Now conscious of the Crusaders' advance, Bayezid acted quickly to neutralize the threat. He gathered his army from his Balkan and Anatolian lands. Nicopolis was a crucial stronghold that ruled the lower Danube because of its advantageous defensive location. Doğan Bey, the Turkish governor of Nicopolis, was ready to withstand a protracted siege and was confident that Bayezid would have to come to the town's rescue because it was well defended and well supplied. Despite their lack of siege weaponry, the Crusaders eventually arrived in Nicopolis. It was impossible to take the castle by force because of this and the strong walls. To starve out the defenders, the Crusaders took up positions throughout the town and established a siege. Following 2 weeks of siege, word of the Turks' approach was spread by foragers who ventured beyond the camps. After that, Sigismund dispatched 500 riders to conduct reconnaissance, and they returned with news that the Turks were certainly approaching. The besieged residents of Nicopolis also heard the news, and they celebrated and blew horns. Marshal Boucicaut, however, asserted that the commotion of their festivities was a charade because he thought the Sultan would never launch an invasion. De Coucy, who led a contingent of 500 knights and 500 mounted archers, was among the few who bothered to scout the situation. He detached 200 horsemen to execute a mock retreat after learning of a sizable contingent of Turks approaching through a nearby pass, luring the pursuing Turks into an ambush. Before withdrawing to the camp, de Coucy's troops slaughtered as many as they could, leaving little space. Sigismund convened a war council after de Coucy and his troops had returned to the camp. The Wallachian footmen, who had fought the Turks before, would be dispatched in the first offensive to confront the Turkish vanguard, according to his proposed battle plan. Since the knights would have to accompany peasant footmen into battle, the plan was criticized by French knight Philippe II as being humiliating to the knights. According to reports, he said, "To take up the rear is to dishonor us and expose us to the contempt of all." At first, the French generals were divided, with some supporting II and others desiring to follow Sigismund's counsel. Ultimately, the French chose to heed II's advice and move forward. Sigismund departed to prepare a strategy for his troops after the French launched a charge. Knowing that the Ottomans were approaching, the Crusaders started to band together under the leadership of their leaders at dawn the following day. To confront the Turks, the French knights went forth with their mounted archers. Under Sigismund, the Germans, Knights Hospitaller, and other allies remained with the Hungarian armies. The knights from France charged. The knights were hindered by rows of sharpened stakes and came under heavy fire from archers. They moved into the ranks of trained infantry and routed the untrained conscripts on the Turkish front line. They were able to push the Ottoman forces' front lines back, to give themselves a break and give the Hungarians time to move up to a position where they might assist the French. Key and Vian suggested that the French take a break and reorganize their forces. But they were overpowered by the younger knights, who insisted on pursuing because they didn't know how big the Turkish force was, and thought they had just routed Bayezid's whole army. The hunt was carried on by the French knights. By this time, over half had been dismounted since so many horses had been slain by stakes or arrows. When they arrived at the plateau at the top of the slope, struggling in their heavy armor, they were met with a new corps of Ottoman troops that Bayezid had held in reserve, rather than the escaping Turkish forces they had anticipated. When the French understood how hopeless their current predicament was, some knights fled back down the slope, while the others continued to fight. The main Crusader army, led by Sigismund, eventually overtook the French, who were nearly encircled on the hill. To counter this threat and keep their advantageous location around the French force, the Ottomans dispatched troops. The Crusader force was now nearly encircled by Ottoman cavalry flanking around. The Ottoman horsemen that had made it to the back of the Crusader army were then confronted by Wallachian and Transylvanian cavalry. The Ottoman cavalry was broken by the Crusader cavalry, but they withdrew to the camp to protect their soldiers. Bayezid could now deploy an increasing number of soldiers to attack the main Crusader force, because the whole French force had either retreated, been taken, or been killed. An important reinforcement of 1,500 Serbian knights, led by Stefan Lazarevic, was sent to the Turks at this time. The force of Sigismund was overpowered. The remainder of the Crusader force was either slain or taken prisoner, and Sigismund withdrew back to the main camp. Nearly every member of the 20,000-man Crusader army had been killed or taken prisoner by the end of the conflict. Although the exact number is unknown, the Ottomans suffered greatly as well, certainly in the thousands. "We lost the day by the pride and vanity of these French," Sigismund told the Hospitaller master after returning to the camp. "We had enough men to defeat our enemy if they followed my advice." All of the detainees were collected by the Ottomans. A French knight named Jacques de Haley, who had previously served under an Ottoman sultan, was recognized by the Turks and asked to identify the nobles in exchange for payment. The Turks took anyone who was deemed to be younger than 20 as slaves. Before the sultan, the remaining several thousand inmates were marched nude with their wrists bound. Every prisoner was then killed by a team of executioners who either severed their limbs from their bodies or beheaded them. The remaining noble prisoners were made to watch the executions from Bayezid's side. The murders went on from early in the morning until late in the afternoon, when Bayezid called off the executioners because he was either disgusted by the carnage or because his ministers believed he was inciting Christendom against him needlessly. Few people who escaped the battlefield made it out alive. The majority perished when attempting to cross the Danube again, and the crusaders who survived were left to fend for themselves in rags while trekking through the forests, with many of the famished survivors passing away in the process. The 350-mile march to Gallipoli was required of the remaining inmates who had not been put to death. In France, January 9th was designated as a day of mourning. On January 20th, 1397, a team carrying lavish presents for Bayezid departed Paris to negotiate the ransoms. In the Sultan's court, French negotiators agreed on a 200,000 gold florin ransom. In February 1398, the remaining crusaders returned to France with 7 or 8 more knights. The European powers' lack of unity and cooperation was brought to light by the defeat. Additionally, it prompted a re-evaluation of tactics for countering the Ottoman menace, which ultimately helped to create the Holy League and other more coordinated efforts in subsequent conflicts. The Ottoman conquest of Nicopolis strengthened their hold on the Balkans, increased their threat to Central Europe, and kept pressure on Constantinople.